Good morning. Thanks for coming. Hopefully some other people will be dribbling in. My name's Edie Lewis, and I'll be helping facilitate this morning. Those of you online, welcome also. So this is Dr. Crystal Hall's second week with us, second out of 3. Crystal currently coaches women to create life-giving ministries, and before coaching in ministry, she was the craft assistant professor of biblical studies at United Lutheran Seminary. She grew up in the Lutheran Church and earned her PhD in biblical studies from Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. Before being a seminary professor, she spent years working with churches as a community organizer. So she's committed to liberation for all God's people on the planet, not just in theory, but in practice. So we're excited to have her here with us for week 2. Please, online, if you have any questions or comments, please email us. I'll be monitoring the link. And those of you in our audience, if you could let me know when you would like to share, so I can get you a microphone so we all can hear you, including the people online. So join me in welcoming Dr. Crystal Hall, and we'll get started. Thank you. Welcome.
All right, it is lovely to be back among you today. Thank you for the kind introduction. And as with last week, I'm going to keep things fairly conversational and interactive because it's not fun for me or for you if I talk at you for 45 minutes. So we'll keep things conversational. We've got the help of a mic, and if at any point you're like, Dr. Hall, I have no idea what you just said, or could you say that again, or I have a question, don't hesitate to raise your hand, or for those of us who are joining online, please email your questions in. So we do have roving mics, so we'll, at any point, just raise your hand with a question or a comment, and we'll be sure to include that in the conversation. Okay. So this is week 2 of 3. We are focusing on the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5 and putting that in the broader context of Galatians in its socio-historical context. So I see some faces from last week, which is fantastic. So let's start with what you remember from last week. Oh, I know. It probably feels like a lifetime ago, but what do you remember about what we talked about last week about Paul's letter to the Galatians? What do you remember? And we'll have the help of the mic here. Oh, wait for the mic.
It's the earliest letter, right?
Almost. You are in the ballpark. You are absolutely. I am not a fan of sports. I'm gonna out myself here, but you are in the ballpark. So what we talked last week about how Paul's letters are the earliest documents in the New Testament, absolutely, and the earliest among Paul's letters is probably 1 Thessalonians. But you are totally right that Galatians is among the earliest, for sure. So remember, we talked about how Paul's letters were written in the decade of the 50s of the first century of the Common Era. Yes, absolutely. What else do folks remember from what we talked about last week? Yes?
The area of Galatia is what we know now as Turkey.
Yes.
And that Paul was very angry.
Yes, Paul was very angry. So 2 things there. So first, Paul is writing to churches that are located in what was the Roman imperial province of Galatia. Remember, provinces in the Roman Empire are like states in the United States today. It's like a region. And so Galatia was in what's now modern-day Turkey, and so Paul was writing to churches there. So that's his audience, the people he's writing to. And as you remembered, Paul is pretty angry in this letter. Galatians is known as the angry letter. Does anyone remember why Paul is so angry? Yes. How about here, and then we'll come back over here. Yes. Why was Paul so angry? Let's go go over here first.
It was in response to the notion that people had to become Jewish before they could convert to Christianity.
Yes, absolutely. So, what I'll talk a little bit here about language, because you're totally right. This is the very traditional way to interpret Galatians, to say why Paul is so angry is that he doesn't believe, and he's arguing against the idea that people have to become Torah observant Jews first in order to become part of the church. And a little bit of what I talked about last week in terms of language is that there are, I'm going to say something that might sound a little strange, but there are no Christians in the New Testament. There are literally, like, no one self-identifies as a Christian in the New Testament. The word Christian only occurs 3 times in the New Testament itself, twice in Acts and once in 1 Peter, not in Paul's letters. And it's always used as a term by outsiders, talking about people within the church, and it's used as a derogatory term. So Christian in the first century is not a word that anybody within the church is self-identifying as. So I will typically, as a New Testament scholar, I am literally a professional Bible nerd. And so I will typically use the language of Jesus follower or Jesus believer or churchgoer or member of the church when we're talking about people in the first century, just because there isn't anything that's recognizable as Christianity as we know it today until at least the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. So I will typically not use the word Christian when we're talking about the people in the New Testament, just because that's not the language they would use to identify themselves. But yes, absolutely. So Paul is so angry because he's saying, no, you churches in Galatia, you've got it all wrong. You think that you need to become Torah-observant Jews in order to become part of the church. But I'm telling you that you don't have to become Jewish in order to belong. You don't have to become like us in order to belong in the church. You can remain as you are. Because there were these teachers that were coming to the churches in Galatia saying, you have to become like us in order to belong. And Paul's like, no, be as you are. Be yourselves. Don't become like us, like these other teachers, in order to be part of the community. Yeah, great. Let's take 1 or 2 more. What else do folks remember from what we talked about last week, if you were here last week? Did you want to jump in again? Not right this second. Totally fine. Let's take maybe 1 or 2 more. What else do folks remember from last week? No pop quizzes here, I promise. Okay, so these are some of the core issues that we talked about, which is great. So remember, we have the author, whose name is Paul. He's an apostle. He writes to these churches in the province of Galatia, which is in modern-day Turkey, and he writes to them a letter. So this is a letter. Remember how I talked about last week? It's like hearing only 1/2 of the phone conversation. So we are eavesdropping, if you will, on a conversation that we only have half of. So Paul writes this letter, but we have no idea what the churches write back to him or what they might have to say back. So we only have half the conversation. So if that letter gets discovered in the sands of Egypt someday, I am going to be so excited to know what those churches in Galatia had to say back to Paul the Apostle. Okay, so it's a letter, and in antiquity, letters are organized in a certain way. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the structure of the letter today as we get closer and closer to talking about our focal passage in the fruits of the Spirit. So there are 3 sections to this letter. There are 3 sections. The first section is where Paul tells his own story. So Paul, as we talked about a little bit last week, is an apostle. He is someone who is called by God to preach a gospel to the nations, to the Gentiles. Gentile in the New Testament is just a fancy way for saying people who are not Jewish. Another way to translate that exact same word in Greek, which is ethne, which is where we get the word ethnic in English, that word ethne could also be translated as nations. So Paul, as a Torah-observant Jew, receives a call from Christ to preach a gospel to the ethne in Greek, or to the nations, or to the Gentiles, is how you'll often see it most translated in the New Testament. And so Paul, as a Jew, is called to preach to who? To people who are not like him, to people who are other than him. Paul is called to preach the gospel by constantly going out into communities that are not his own. So he, as a Jew, is being called into relationship with the other, with people who are different than him, people that are foreign from him, people who have different cultures and languages and norms, that he is always being called out into relationship with the other. And so in the first 2 chapters of Galatians, he talks about his own story. He talks about receiving this call. He talks about his early ministry. He mentions the fact that he had founded these churches in Galatia and then goes off and does other things. So that's what's happening in the first 2 chapters. So let me pause here. What are your comments or questions about what I've said so far? Because again, I promise I'm not going to talk at you for 45 minutes. So what are your comments and questions about what I've said so far? Yes, here in the back, if you could wait for the mic. Oh.
Who's it for? Oh, sorry, I didn't see that.
So that was a completely new concept for the Jews, to step outside of their community. And this is sort of the first idea of
Could you put the
missionary-
mic just a little bit closer? Yeah, perfect.
This was the first idea of missionary work. This is a completely new idea for the Jewish community.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that in this period, the Jews are known as a particularly insular people. Especially within the context of the Roman Empire, the Romans had no idea what to do with the Jews, because they, remember last week how we talked about in this culture, in this time period, the expectation was that you not only worshiped the gods of your local place, but you also worshiped the gods of the Roman Empire. And so the Romans had no idea what to do with the Jews because they only worshiped one god, which they thought was very strange. And they were also, to your question, a people that were tended to keep among themselves. So they tended to marry within their community. They tended to worship only within their community because they were what we would call today monotheistic, although that's not a term that they would have used themselves. And so what is missionary, if you will, about the activity of Paul is that he is a Jew who is then, because of this call that he's received from God, going out to found these churches, these communities of Jesus believers throughout the Roman Empire. So he's not just in Turkey, he's also in Greece, he's also in Italy, and so he travels throughout the entire Mediterranean basin, on foot, mind you. Remember, there's no cars and planes and trains in the first century. So he's traveling on all these old Roman roads to go throughout the empire to tell this story about this call that he's received from Jesus. And so this is a new innovation at this point. So he is a Jew who's reinterpreting his tradition in light of this revelation he's received from God through Christ. So yes and no. It's a great question. Other comments or questions about what we've talked about so far? Yes, how about back here, and then we'll come up front.
I always thought that Paul was a disciple. What's the difference between disciple and apostle?
Yes, great question. So if we wanted to think about the broad category as disciple, and then the more sort of specific category within disciple, there are particular disciples who are called as apostles. So apostle in English comes from the Greek apostolos, which is a Greek word that means a messenger who is specifically commissioned to deliver a particular message. And so the word apostolos in the Greco-Roman culture, actually, it's not unique to the church. It's a term that existed within the broader culture. And so say if you were the governor of a province, for example, you would send out an apostolos, you would send out an apostle to proclaim your victory over the locals, for example. You would commission someone specifically to send your message out into a particular region or community. And so apostle then becomes a term that the church co-opts from the broader culture to say we too are going to send out our particularly commissioned disciples. So again, disciples, sort of the broad category. And then there are specific disciples who are commissioned as apostles, who have this particular mission to proclaim the gospel. And so apostle takes on this more specific and technical term within the church, even though it exists within the broader culture. And one thing I'll say about Paul's apostleship in particular is that Paul's got a chip on his shoulder. So not only is Galatians the angry letter, but in general, Paul is someone as an apostle who's got a chip on his shoulder. Why? Because he does not have experience directly with the earthly ministry of Jesus. So in the Gospels, you have all these stories about the apostles, the 12, right? The 12 apostles. You have all these stories about Peter and James and John and all these disciples who walk with Jesus. But then a generation later, we have Paul. So Paul is actually someone who never experienced Jesus' earthly ministry, but he receives that gospel from other members of the church and directly from his revelation that he receives from God. So you'll notice this, we won't go into this in this series, but there are a lot of there's a lot of issues in the first couple of chapters of Galatians where Paul just wants to say, so I just want you to know that I received this message directly from God and not from anybody else. Like he's very emphatic in saying, I as an apostle am called directly from Jesus because of this chip he's got on his shoulder, that he doesn't have that direct experience of Jesus' earthly ministry. So I had a question up front, and then we'll come over here, and then we'll come back here.
Yeah, you sort of partially answered that. What, technically speaking, was the means by which this letter or the others were transmitted? Did he have someone, taking notes as he was going along?
Yeah.
Or how have we received this information to the degree of specificity that it's being recorded or that it's being transmitted?
Yes, great question. So folks don't have Bibles in their pews, do they? That's okay. All right, so I will read for you to answer your question from later in chapter 6, where Paul says, this is chapter 6, starting at verse 11, he says, the letter actually tells us, see what large letters I make when I am writing in my own hand. So the tradition in antiquity, because the vast majority of people can't read and write. So Paul is dictating this letter to someone, the scribe, and then in verse 11 of chapter 6, he says, basically what's happened is he's taken the parchment away from the scribe, and he's writing his own PS in his own hand, because he says, see what large letters I make when I am writing in my own hand. Right? But if you don't have that historical context, you would have no, why is Paul saying, look at my scribble? I mean, that's what he's saying in the text. So the tradition is that you'd have someone you'd dictate the letter to somebody, and they would write down what you said. And of course, as they're writing down what you say, what are they doing? They're editing, they're smoothing things over, they're making it sound a little nicer, right? So the scribe is dictating, if you will. You're dictating to the scribe. And then typically what people would do was then they would say, in order to authenticate the letter so that you know it's really me, I'm going to write the last PS. And I'm going to sign it myself. So that's the evidence for this sort of practice, even within the letter itself. So if folks have Bibles, this is chapter 6, starting at verse 11. I won't read the whole section, but just so you've got a sense of where that shows up in the text. And then remember last week how we talked about Paul's letters are the earliest documents within the New Testament. And so these letters, Galatians, Romans, what would become 1st and 2nd Corinthians, they would all travel together as a collection of letters. So these are the earliest documents within the New Testament. Remember last week we talked about how the Gospels are written decades and decades later. And so the way that these letters would initially be transmitted is that they would travel in collections of letters, and they would be read aloud in the context of worship. And so remember, because the vast majority of people can't read and write in this period, and there's nothing like a HarperCollins study Bible, right, that exists in the first century of the Common Era. So the way that people were encountering these letters was that people would gather, churches would gather, and they would read Paul's letters aloud, and they would then, there would be someone that would be there specifically not only to make sure that the letter had been communicated, but also that it was properly interpreted, which is fascinating. I will give one last example of this because I just can't help myself, and then we'll go on to this other. We'll go on to the other couple of questions. So we'll just skip around a little bit. So if you go to Romans for a second, Romans chapter 16. Verse 1, this is an example of this tradition. So Romans chapter 16, verse 1 reads, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting to the saints, etc. So the first greeting at the end of the letter is to Phoebe, who's described as a deacon, and it's Phoebe who's responsible for interpreting the letter. So she's probably the carrier of the letter, and she is the one who is responsible for interpreting the letter to the church at Rome. Side note, we've got Phoebe the deacon in this chapter. We also have Junia, another woman, who's described as an apostle in the same chapter. So that's another series. We can do that another time. But notice that we have these women who are being charged with leadership positions within the earliest church, including the interpretation of Paul's words and his letter. So let's come back to Galatians. So we had a comment or question here, and then over here, and then we'll move on to the next piece.
You were saying that, Paul had a chip on his shoulder, and I think that when I was thinking over what you were saying, that I was wondering, it seems very courageous to me because it was going against everything that was told, and he didn't have a direct relationship with Christ. So I almost feel like he had to have sort of that bravado to be able to pull off essentially what he was trying to do. Mm-hmm. So it kind of seems that maybe it was his coping mechanism for being courageous in this world that maybe didn't, that he was trying to get this point across. And,
yes.
here, you got to believe me because this came to me from
Directly from
right,
God.
right,
Yes.
right.
Yep,
I
exactly.
don't know. That's kind of how I looked at it. Like, he was pretty courageous in this time. Even though he's angry, I think it was really courageous of him to like make that letter and sort of yell at them and say, hey, no, that's not what I was talking about.
No, yes, exactly. Yes, thank you for that comment. So, one of the things that I think is so important to appreciate, not only about Paul's letters, but also the New Testament broadly, is that in the 21st century in the United States, this is a Christian dominant context in the sense that the society is becoming increasingly more secular, but like Christianity is still the dominant religion within the United States today. And so Christianity in the US is considered normative. And so what's so different, though, about the New Testament is that in the first century of the Common Era, the church is not at the center of the story. Not by any stretch of the imagination. So remember, Paul is a Jew. Paul's a Torah-observant Jew who's received a message from Jesus to preach to the nations, to these people who are different than him. And the Jews are already seen as this small, strange, marginalized people within the first century of the Common Era. And then, on top of that, you have these Jews who are already strange and weird from the perspective of the dominant culture. And then within the Jewish community, you have people who start believing in this guy named Jesus, who got himself crucified by the Romans. That's even more weird from the perspective of the dominant culture. So your comment that like Paul is actually pretty courageous in this context is totally true, because the church, even though we read it as normative today, like the church in the first century is a marginalized sect within a marginalized religion in this period. And so it's really important to be able to read it within that historical context. So back here, there was a comment, and then we'll come back here. So to my right and then to the left, and then I'm really going to move on, I promise.
And I just wanted to remind people online, I am monitoring the iPad, so please send your questions and comments also.
Okay, I'm just reading ahead, and I'm seeing this part where he's saying he's justifying the fact that he's equivalent to an apostle because he met with the apostles who had actually met with Jesus, and he does clearly have that little chip saying, yeah, I'm just as good as them.
Yep.
But how did he convince, how did he become the spokesperson for this new religion when he, there were these other people who were out being apostles, who were out going around and founding churches. So why did he become the big kahuna?
Yes, there is a much longer answer to that question that would be a series in itself. But what I'll say for now is that Paul, because he claims apostleship and self-identifies as an apostle with this revelation specifically from God, his letters then get placed alongside the Gospels as representative of what was at the time considered the apostolic faith. There were. There absolutely were. There are other letters, but within what becomes the Christian tradition, later church fathers, and I use that word intentionally because they were all men, the early church fathers favor Paul over and against other apostles.
Is that because he says he was the apostle for the non-Jews as opposed to the other apostles who were the apostles for only the Jews?
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely when you're a marginalized religion that is growing in number, you want to favor the kinds of apostles who are going out to evangelize to the non-Jews. So yes, I mean, there's definitely, I think, some motivation there to want to favor people like Paul over and against others. Back here, and then here, and this is going to be the last one, and then we're really going to get to the fruits of the Spirit.
I couldn't get by the second sentence in here where he says, I and the group of friends now with me send greetings to the Christian congregations of Galatia.
Ooh, what,
So the
what
word
translation are you reading?
Christians is there in the first. So
Oh, say that again?
I mean, the word Christians was said there so early.
What translation are you reading?
Whatever this is.
Oh, New English Bible.
Oh, the New English Bible.
New English Bible. It's okay.
Okay.
So, it's okay. I'm just going to, just as an example, thank you for raising this, because these issues of translation are really, really important, and so I'm glad you're raising it. So I'm just going to read you from the New Revised Standard Version, and if I had 3 other Bibles with me, I would read from those 3 translations as well, just so that you can get a sense of how much variation there is across different translations. So for example, in the NRSV, it says, Paul, an apostle, to all the members of God's family who are with me to the churches of Galatia. No mention of the word Christian. If I were to read the Greek for you, which I'm not going to do right now, no mention of the word Christian. Because the word, and this is part of me nerding out as a Bible scholar, like when we look at the original Greek text, there is no word Christian. There's just the word church, there's the word apostle, there's the word Galatia. But in the Greek, this is what's so important, though, about looking at other translations, is that translations are often going to then layer in interpretation on top of the original language, because I know you all are aware that the Bible was not written in English. So, then we have all of these issues of translation. On top of that, why is it that certain Bibles would then add the word Christian on top of the original language? Well, because they're being translated by Christians. So of course they're going to add in that word, even though it's not there in the original Greek.
Thank you.
Yes, great question. Here, you're really going to be our last one, and then we're going to go to the fruits of the Spirit.
With all this extensive historical quote,
Could you just hold the mic just a little bit closer?
Of the apostles and disciples, is there any specific findings or information, I mean, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, or that would give sort of finality to different areas in the Bible that are important. And it seems that most of this information is oral,
Yes.
passing from one to another, but and I'm sort of trying to get a specific answer to an impossible question. So please forgive me, but it's been rolling around in my mind, and maybe you can shed some light on it.
Yes, I will do my best, but I'm going to pick up on your theme that in New Testament scholarship, and I think in the work of interpreting the Bible within churches, we don't get to the finality. Like even with these new discoveries, like the Dead Sea Scrolls or other new manuscripts, I would offer that we never get to a final answer on any of these issues. We only get better at asking questions. Like our questions just become more and more sophisticated as we engage with these texts, because there's always new discoveries. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the middle of the 20th century and massively changed the way that both the Old Testament and the New Testament were interpreted. There's probably still scrolls to be discovered in the sands of Egypt, which might also then massively change the way that Scripture is interpreted. So I would offer that we're probably not going to get to any final answers, either today or in the life of the church around these questions. But I think the more that we engage with these texts, the better we get at answering those kinds of questions, and the more that we're grounded in the historical context I think the richer those kinds of questions can become, which is a very unsatisfying answer, but I appreciate you raising the question. All right, so I promise we're actually going to get to our focal text now. We're going to do some work in this week and next week, and I am going to let you go by 11:15. So our focal text, if you want to turn to Galatians chapter 5, so if you're in a Bible, it's going to be about here in the Bible.
Sorry.
It's going to be right about here toward the end. And I'm going to be in chapter 5 of Galatians, starting at verse 22. I'll just read our fruits of the Spirit passage and then provide a little context. So Galatians 5, starting at verse 22, and I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. So if you're reading from a Bible in the pews, what was the translation y'all are reading? Oh, they're all different. Oh, even better. Okay. So just be aware that your translation that you're reading might sound slightly different than the New Revised that I'm going to be reading, which is good and important to notice those differences. So Galatians chapter 5, starting at verse 22. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us be guided by the Spirit. This is why this passage is called the fruits of the Spirit, because of this mention of the Spirit here. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. Okay, so you remember how I said there were 3 sections in Galatians? We talked about one, which is Paul's own story, and then we had some lovely discussion. Section 2 is where Paul basically provides his scriptural proof for his argument, and then, which we're not going to focus on today. And then this passage, which includes this fruits of the Spirit passage that I just read, this occurs in section 3. So section 3 is chapters 5 and 6 of Galatians, and I like to call this third section of Galatians the so what section. This is the what the heck do we do with what you have been teaching us about why we are so wrong section. Remember, because Paul is writing this letter because he's angry about what the churches are doing in Galatia, which he thinks is wrong. And the thing he thinks is wrong, remember, is that they are excluding people on the basis of saying you must become Jewish in order to become part of the church. That's how they are being exclusionary in their practices. They're saying, like, you have to become like us in order to belong first, which Paul is like, no, that's not, you missed the whole point. So chapters 5 and 6 is the so what section. It's the what do we do, what are the ethics, what do we do about what I have been teaching you in the rest of the letter, which we're not going to look at today. And so Paul here lists these virtues. So starting again in verse 22, the fruit of the Spirit, he lists these virtues like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So the reason that he's emphasizing in this section these kinds of virtues is because it fits within this larger section of, okay, based on what I'm teaching you, what do you then do about it? And so this section, the fancy academic word here for this section is that it is paranesis. It's called the parenetical section. So you can pull that out at a cocktail party. Oh, in the parenetical section of Galatians in chapters 5 and 6, Paul is concerned about the ethics of, whatever. So this is the paranesis. This is the ethics section. And so part of the ethics here is to embody these virtues like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity. So Paul is saying, okay, I heard that you were excluding people from the church. I'm going to tell you why. That's not the call. That's not the gospel that I preached to you. But here's what I want you to do. Here's how you embody what it means to be church. Here's how you enact what it means to be living out this gospel that I have preached to you. Okay, I'm going to pause again. And let's take another short round of comments or questions before we wrap up. What are your questions and comments about what we're talking about? Yes, over here.
So I'm looking at the Bible, the new, I don't know what this, New International Version.
Oh, another
online.
translation, yeah.
And some of the wording is very different from what you read. Mm-hmm. And so I think that makes a big difference too, because and it's just subtle things, like some of them are very similar, but like one of the words that they use in here was, I think, forbearance. Mm-hmm. Kindness, love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Mm-hmm. Were the words that they use. So that could have, some of those words have very different meanings than some of the words that you read.
Yes. Patience versus forbearance, right? Forbearance, at least to me, sounds like much heavier. Yeah, and more negative versus patience. I mean, patience, that has its own nuances that we could look at. But what's so good and important to notice here is that all translation is interpretation. All translation is interpretation. So we're not looking at the original Greek here. We could talk about how it's getting into the original Greek. That's a whole nother conversation all by itself, because all we have is copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. Scholarship has no access to original texts. We don't have Paul's actual letter. We just have copies from centuries after Paul's letter. So all translation is interpretation. And so as you do your own study of these texts, I really would encourage you to read across multiple translations. So read the New Revised, read the King James, read the Common English Bible, read several translations to compare them, because you'll notice that different translators are going to make different interpretive decisions as they're looking at the original languages. If they're even looking at the original languages, because they may be translating based on a previous translation. Oh, you see how complicated this gets? Right? So, for example, the New Revised Standard Version that I'm reading from is not a translation, it's a version, which means it's actually it's an update from a previous, so it's basically a translation of a translation. So, yes. Maybe let's take one other comment or question before we wrap up, and I'll talk a little bit about where we're going next week. Yes, if you could just wait for the mic so people can hear.
Why was that so different from what Judaism or the other religions of the day and society taught? Be kind, be gentle, be helpful.
So what I would offer here, again, there's a much longer answer here, but what I would offer is that because Paul himself is a Jew, he is reinterpreting his own Jewish tradition in light of Jesus. And so these ethical concerns about love and joy and peace and patience, these are all indigenous to Judaism. And so what Paul here is doing is he's reinterpreting that same ethic, that same called, and this is why he says there is no such law against these things, because he's saying, as a Torah observant Jew, I'm very concerned about the role of the law here. And these virtues like joy and peace and patience, there's no law against these things. Within my tradition, within the observance of the law, there's no contradiction between these virtues and the tradition of the law. And so here Paul is, so I wouldn't make too fine of a distinction between, say, Judaism on the one hand and the church on the other hand, because especially in the first century, there's no neat distinction yet. Like everyone in the first century anyway, is still running around Jewish.
Right.
It's only later that the separation starts happening.
But why then would this be so important to say? Wasn't it just accepted knowledge?
Yes. So because of the way Paul is reinterpreting, because of the revelation he's received from Jesus, that's where he starts to make some of these distinctions. To say, here's the Jewish tradition, but then here's how I'm reinterpreting the tradition because of Jesus. And so as those interpretations become more and more distinct, that's when what will become Christianity then becomes more and more separate from Judaism. But in the first century, like especially as Paul is writing, like that distinction hasn't even happened yet. But it's so easy to read that back into the text because of the way we understand it now. We read that retroactively back into the text. So this is part of the work of sort of reorienting to the context that it's written in. Great question. Okay, so I am at my time. So I'm just going to let you know where we are going next week. So next week, we're going to look again at this passage, the fruits of the Spirit passage, but we're going to read it within the context of the previous passage, which, at least in my Bible, is titled The Works of the Flesh. Ooh. So we're going to look next week at verses 22 to 26 in the literary context of verses 16 to 21. So if you want to do a little reading between now and next week, we're going to look a couple of verses prior. We're going to look at verses 16 to 21 within the context of 22 to 26. All right. Thank you for being so engaged today and for your questions and comments, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next Sunday for our third and final session.
And thank you. Thank you for joining us. And thanks everyone for spending your time with us today. Hope to see you next week too. Thank you.